What does it mean to be trans and fat? What does the politics of space have to do with the medical system? How do we resist the oppression laid against trans and fat bodies? Join me as I seek to answer these questions and more in my discussion of the trans fat experience. Hi, I'm Mars Atkins, and I happen to be non-binary and fat. I've lived in these identities for most of my life, and recently established connections between my experiences and what I previously perceived as separate identities. In this podcast, we will explore the oppressions faced by trans and fat bodies and how they intersect and exacerbate one another, dictated by politics of space and belonging. We'll dive into this topic through discussions of what it means to be fat and trans, the systems that affect trans fat bodies, and how we may resist said oppressions. To establish what experiences of trans fat people look like, we first have to establish what it means to be trans fat. So basically, trans fat is a term coined by Jessica Asay to describe the physical, emotional, social, and political experience of being both trans and fat. Now you may be asking, Mars, isn't trans fat a molecule? And the answer would be yes it is. But it's also an identity based on the lived experiences of those who are both transgender and fat. Despite originating from a film student's dissertation, the name's connection to health provides a rich metaphor for the experiences of transgender fat people. Trans fats are the boogeymen hidden under the bed of the food industry. Labels proudly adorn a badge of honor, bragging in bright letters, zero trans fat or trans fat free. And why wouldn't they? It's good advertising. They're highly associated with processed foods, with unnaturalness, with greed, and sickness. This echoes the sentiments trans fat people face. Both identities are seen as unnatural, a state of being derived from selfish intentions or a lack of self-control. Like the trans fat molecule, trans fat people are treated as if their existence disturbs the delicate balances of nature. In both cases, this is untrue. Trans fats aren't some man-made horror, well, they are in some cases, but they're also naturally occurring in whole foods and can be perfectly fine in moderation, as all nutrients are. The trans fat identity embodies this disconnect between perception and reality. The experiences of trans fat people can also be connected to a concept used in fat studies, mind-body dualism. Mind-body dualism is the ideology that mind is superior and, more importantly, separate from the body. In the context of fatness, it separates the fat body from personhood, and it can similarly be applied to trans bodies in that autonomy over one's body is seen as a privilege rather than a right in context of gender expression and medical transition. The trans body is property of legislature and social law and is a separate entity from a real-life trans person. Trans fat people experience mind-body dualism through the separation of personhood from the body. Trans fat people are treated as bodies, not people, and the intersecting issues of one's transness and fatness are often ignored. This separation is strengthened by the theoretical constructions of being created by trans fat stereotypes. So there's two categories I like to kind of think about them within. And that's the theoretical lazy fat person and the theoretical predatory trans person. Trans and fat people are often portrayed and discussed as theoretical silhouettes reflected on the cave wall of ignorance. Fat people are not seen as people, but perceptions and stereotypes that have collected over the years, whether it be through media, personal experiences, or how they've been socialized. Each fat person exists as a reflection of this caricature, making everyone who isn't thin lazy, unmotivated, greedy, and frankly gross in the media's eyes. People often make the mistake of forgetting there isn't just a person in a fat body, that fat bodies are people. In the same respect, trans people are created in political cartoons depicting a man in a wig or the transphobic tirades of perverts in the bathroom. Trans people are the monster under the bed, sneaky, conniving, destructing the peaceful, safe environments created by cisgender society. If you couldn't tell, that was sarcastic. Trans people aren't people. They're an imaginary enemy made up by the stereotypes created in media. Personhood is stripped from identity, and trans people are not multidimensional beings, but flat presentations of preconceived expectations of what it means to be a transgender. I personally believe that these creations of superficial understandings of trans fat states of being are defined by social politics of space that trans fat identities break up. Both being trans and being fat take up space, whether it be physical, mental, theoretical. In being fat, one takes up space physically, and in being trans, one takes up theoretical gendered space. Both threaten the security of thin cis ideals. Being fat challenges moral notions of thinness. In existing unapologetically as one is in a fat body, it disrupts the belief that thinness is inherently more valuable, and therefore you can't be happy if you're fat, because if thinness is better than fatness, you should only ever be able to achieve happiness through being thin, which is not true. Being trans challenges the precarious and arbitrary gendered social. Being trans challenges the precarious and arbitrary gendered structures upheld by social, political, medical, and systemic concepts. Trans people disrupt the carefully curated categorizations and understandings of gender, and in taking up these theoretical gendered spaces, we challenge understandings of power that have been built for centuries. This disruption is seen as an act of aggression. By merely existing, trans people threaten patriarchal cis power dynamics, and thus the patriarchy. With biological factors of gender disrupted, the power men hold as the supposed stronger sex is rendered useless, undermining the superficial rationales that keep them in control. With any disruption of long-standing social beliefs, there's obviously going to be pushback, hence the violence and vitriol trans people face as backlash to their very existence. Okay, now at this point, you may be saying, well, this is all well and good, but how does it connect to healthcare, Mars? Don't worry, there was a point to all of that. Transness and fatness are heavily medicalized, providing people, especially doctors, with a sense of entitlement to dictate the boundaries of one's existence, how one should or shouldn't live, where one can exist, when one can exist, and how much space one may take up, visually, mentally, social, theoretically, and physically. Being fat within a medical system denies one access to the same quality of medical care and medical concern as thin bodies. Horror stories of medical neglect based on weight are easy to come by. Ask nearly any fat person, and they'll tell you how a doctor has told them they needed to lose weight instead of addressing a serious medical issue. Similarly, trans people have to fight to access life-saving gender-affirming care. Most doctors are not trained on how to give trans-inclusive healthcare and can be affected by biases and stereotypes. I've heard stories of doctors denying hormones because their patient wasn't trans enough, or because they didn't feel comfortable supporting someone with that kind of lifestyle. Trans people are constantly told they need to medically transition to be considered trans, but at the same time, medically transitioning is seen as mutilating oneself. Opinions are weighted over trans bodies as if they're a doll to be dressed up to one's own expectations of how they should look. People feel entitled to personal medical information and decisions when they meet a trans person. Just saying, if trans people got $1 every time they were asked what they had down there, they might actually be able to afford bottom surgery. The same entitlement over the body seen from strangers also impacts trans people's visits to the doctor's office, especially trans fat people. Doctors deny trans people the right to make their own decisions about their bodies, based on what they feel is correct to do. So, we've established that the politics of space are disrupted by trans fat bodies, but at the same time, they also constrict trans fat access within medical spaces. Doctors have so much control over the health and well-being of trans fat people, as they are the gatekeepers of care. Gender-affirming surgeries and other affirming care are regularly denied to trans fat people based on outdated factors such as BMI or personal bias. By existing as disruptors of space, trans fat people face greater challenges in dictating their own space. But this is where healthism really kicks in. At the same time, trans fat people are denied control over their space because they don't conform to quote-unquote standard forms of being. They are blamed for their own existence. So, for a quick explanation, healthism is a discourse that dictates health as the main signifier of value in a society. Health is ascribed a moral status and contributed to the individual's success or failure of a person. Within the realm of healthism, one's success as a moral or worthy human being is determined primarily by how fat or how skinny they look. Being fat is seen as moral failure, which contributes to the objectification of fat bodies not as humans, but as physical indicators of moral weakness. Although trans bodies are not necessarily as connected to healthism specifically, trans fat bodies are especially vulnerable to the intersecting stigmatization of transphobia and healthism combined. By being less morally valuable because of your weight, you are considered less credible as a human being to make sound decisions. This intersects with the difficulties trans people have in accessing gender-affirming healthcare, and it undermines their ability to decide how they choose to exist. How much space and how you take up space is controlled by healthcare systems, which are informed by social norms born out of healthism and transphobia. So, having lived as a fat non-binary person for a while now, I'm a living example of experiences faced by trans fat people in medical systems. As a little look into how I exist as a trans fat person, as part of my expressions of gender, I wear bright flowy clothes, have bright yellow hair. I shift between masculinity and femininity, which can undermine my authority sometimes. Add being fat onto all of that, and you get the perfect recipe for medical neglect. I've had many health issues throughout my life, whether mental or physical, and neglect for my personhood and autonomy as a result of my fatness and transness has affected nearly every health-based interaction I've ever had. For example, when I was in 10th grade, probably 10th grade. When I was in 10th grade, I started having seizures. I didn't really know what was happening to me, was just seizing, and I was taken from doctor to neurologist to MRIs, all of that. But throughout this whole experience, I was not taken seriously, and I was told I was faking. I was told it's common in kids like you to fake things for attention, and I was told they were tics, that all these different things. And the basis of it is my serious, legitimate health concerns were not taken seriously based on the quick interaction I had with a doctor in which they used my appearance to dictate the legitimacy of my illness. When I was actually diagnosed with having seizures, I went to a neurologist who said, if you want to stop having seizures, maybe you should lose weight and exercise more. Yes, because running will stop me from, falling to the floor and seizing. Psh, why didn't I think of that before? If I feel like I'm gonna have a seizure, I should just start doing jumping jacks, right? Because that makes so much sense. It's definitely my extra weight that's causing me to have muscle spasms and, neurological issues. But yeah, anyways. Even after I kind of denied that and I said, I'm as healthy as I can be at this point. I don't think my weight has anything to do with my seizures. I just want medication, right? The doctor said, I could give you this medication, but I'm not going to because it could make you gain weight and you don't want that. Are you kidding me? I was having 10 seizures a day, and the doctor denied me life-altering medication because I was fat? Stuff like this happens all the time, and there's so many more stories, even just from me. That kind of power imbalance where you don't have autonomy over your own body just because a doctor thinks they know better than you really, really sucks. And quite honestly, all of this has kind of been disheartening, I understand. Recognizing the power dynamics present in medical systems is disheartening, but it's a necessary first step to disrupting them. I want to finish out this podcast by discussing what the future of good trans fat medical care looks like. Trans-informed healthcare is extremely important. Doctors need to understand the complexities of gender and unlearn the medical definitions they've been taught. Discussing preferred names and pronouns in appointments, what accessing gender-affirming healthcare means to a patient, and what future the patient wants is important to creating welcoming environments that support transitions rather than gatekeep them. Additionally, trans healthcare, and all healthcare really, needs to adopt a health at every size approach in which moral value judgments are separated from body weight to produce a judgment-free atmosphere where patients can access healthcare no matter their size. To steal from Foucault, because who doesn't like to steal from Foucault? Where there's power, there's resistance. Trans fat oppression is met with trans fat liberation. Reclaiming power over our bodies is an important step towards disrupting the effects of healthism. Whether it be denying others' entitlements over our bodies by simply refusing to engage in body-based discussions, or rejecting outward measures of value of our bodies by rejecting the scale, and rejecting definitions of passing. Trans fat people have the power to take control over their bodies. On a larger scale, we have to advocate for better access to gender-affirming care that centers health at every size. I challenge you to embrace fatness, to embrace transness. Our bodies are our own. No one else is entitled to anything about them. Self-empowerment is self-love, and as we end this podcast, I implore you to love yourself in your entirety as both a body and a mind.